Denise Robitaille is principal of Robitaille Associates. She's the author of numerous books on quality topics. She's an internationally recognized speaker who brings years of experience in business and industry to her work in the quality profession. Robitaille is an active member of the U.S. TAG, the ISO QC 176, the committee responsible for updating the ISO 9000 family of standards. She's also an Exemplar Global Certified Lead Assessor and ASQ Certified Quality Auditor and a Fellow of the ASQ. She's conducted training courses for thousands of individuals on corrective actions, management review, auditing, document control, and implementing ISO 9001. Denise, take it away.
Thanks very much, and hello, everyone. This presentation is going to discuss what is happening with ISO 19011. It is being revised, and it's appropriate as we go through this revision to communicate with you folks and let you know why it's important that you know about the changes that are happening to 19011. Let's start at the beginning with, what is this standard? Most people refer to this as the ISO auditing standard. That's not a bad description of it, but let's look a little bit more closely at exactly what its purpose and its intent is. And this actually goes to part of the reason that it is being revised. We look here, and in 2002, the title was Guidelines for Quality and/or Environmental Management System Standards. So we fast forward, and we're looking at 20, and it's XX because we are expecting that the revision is going to be complete next year in 2018, but we're never 100% sure on that, so we leave it at XX. But you'll see that it now says Guidelines for Auditing Management System Standards. So what has happened here is that there has been an expansion, a broadening of the scope of this standard so that it goes beyond just quality standards, typically ISO 9001, and the environmental standards found ISO 14001. Well, why has that become important? Well, there's a whole bunch of other new standards that have come out of the woodwork in the last few years. There are multiple management system standards, and they're not all considered quality management system standards. And you see up on the screen here, we've got examples of a few of those standards. We've got 45001 that we expect to have released sometime either this year or the beginning of next, which has to do with occupational health and safety. We have 27001 dealing with information management systems, 5001 energy management, and this is just a small sampling of all of the management system standards that are found, and those are just the ones within the ISO family. There are many other management system standards that are not under that scope, for example, AS 9100, IATF 16949, etc. So because of this proliferation of management system standards and the fact that auditing is one of the common denominators across all these management system standards, it is appropriate for us to put this project together so that the concerns of those management system standards, those things that are unique to those, are addressed, and to ensure that none of the language in this standard that we are now revising would conflict with any of those requirements or be an obstacle to people's ability to use it within their systems. Because in many of these organizations, we've mentioned these multiple management system standards. Some organizations, many of them, are required to conform to multiple management system standards. So how are you going to audit these if you've got different standards if you've got different rules for auditing different standards? So we want to have one generic document that allows for the auditing of these integrated systems and organizations where they have multiple management system standards. Some of the other things that have driven this change are the fact that there have been changes in technology. We have things today that we did not have 15 years ago. We've got things that are digitized. We've got a lot more tools at our fingertips. We've got a lot more of our documentation that is virtual. We have a lot of requirements that are embedded in software. Many of these things affect audits and some of the language that we use when we discuss auditing, when we talk about documented information, or if we talk about documents and records. One of the other things that has happened is the evolution of this new tool in auditing, which is what we refer to as virtual auditing. And let me just comment briefly on that. There was a decision made that in terms of this virtual auditing, that it's not a different type of auditing. It simply is auditing utilizing different tools, and I'll discuss this again later on. But it is something that is important and, again, affects the language of 19,011. The other thing that has become prevalent across all management system standards is the heightened focus on risk. Looking at risk. So it is appropriate to look at risk in several different ways as it relates specifically to the audit process, and also how auditors need to look at risk in the manner in which they look at systems and how they audit the manner in which organizations are addressing risks and whether or not it is effective and appropriate. So those are some of the things that have driven this change. There are some things that are important to consider from the get-go. Management system standards is something that I've mentioned several times. Those are standards that define all the requirements within a given management system. 19,011 is not a management system standard. Because of that, it does not follow the high-level structure in Annex SL. That is the annex that is defined within the ISO directives. Many of you are familiar with that, as you've seen with the revisions to 9001, 14,001, and others that are in the pipeline, that the standards are all moving to this new structure that has, instead of 8 sections, it has 10 sections, and there's common language and some core definitions that are the same. And people look at that and say, well, why didn't we just have 19,011 follow that same structure? Well, because this is not a management system standard. It is a standard that provides guidance on auditing, on how do you audit that system. So it would have been inappropriate and would have made for a much weaker document, one that would not actually serve if we had attempted to force it, quite frankly, into the Annex SL structure. So that was one of the decisions that was taken. It not only would have not served, but it would have been a detriment to the document. There are a couple of other things that are decisions that were made early on as we were beginning this revision process. And one of them is that there is no definition section. There is a definitions section, but there are no normative references. And the reason for that is that although some documents, some management system standards have as their default ISO 9000 2015 as their normative reference, others cite other normative references, and still others follow the same path that this document follows, in that it has its own definitions. So you're not going to find a normative reference. You'll say, well, why doesn't it match 9000? It will match 9000 in those places where it is appropriate. And the manner in which that is accomplished is that where the 9000 definition is utilized, it is appropriately cited within the document. Having said all of that, we did strive to accommodate the NXL high-level structure and the terminology that they had. So where it was appropriate, obviously it made more sense to have a definition that was common with the one that was in Annex SL to be of most use to the marketplace. So we understood that it was important for the users of this document to not have too many terms that did not appear to have, or have terms that have multiple definitions. So we have minimized that as much as possible to the extent that we are in the revision stages so far. So we always had that sense that we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, if you will, this Annex SL. However, since this is not a management system standards, there were times when it was appropriate to diverge. Why is this important? Why is it such a big deal that we all care about 19,011? Well, for one thing, it is the guideline that's referenced in ISO 9001. It is also referenced in others, but chiefly in ISO 9001. And we've got something in the nature, the most recent figures is 1.4 million certified organizations around the globe. So that's a lot of them who look to, section 9.3 in ISO 9001 and see this reference that says, for more guidance, look at 19,011. So this is an important document. For some companies, small companies especially, but not necessarily, this is the only guidance that they have. Many of us who have been in the quality business, if you will, we live in this community, in this environment that we have begun to talk years ago, just assume that everyone else understood this whole concept of internal auditing or auditing. And we speak about it as we would speak about, walking and eating. And yet there are many organizations who are required to conform to management systems or, be that ISO or others, for whom the whole concept of auditing is completely alien. And this document is all that they've got. This is their lifeline. And so this document has got to be something that they can use, that they can look to this and say, this is how we do it, and this is how we do it so that not only does it make sense, but that so it is a benefit to us. So it's important that we get this document right. This is not a fluff document. This is not a minor document. This document is very prominent, and again, we are expecting that its use is extended or expanded with the proliferation of more management system standards. For those of you who are familiar with the document and have been using it for a while, some of you who are familiar with the ISO structure and the technical committee structure, a little bit about where the document has been and who had ownership of this document and what ended up with it. As we mentioned earlier on, it was at one time predominantly utilized for management systems, quality management systems, and environmental management systems. It found its home in the portfolio of TC-176, which is the technical committee that is responsible for quality management system standards, in their subcommittee that dealt with supporting technologies. And the document, when it was revised in the past, that there was a joint work done with 207, which is the environmental group, in order to come up with the standard. But it was primarily owned by the Quality Management System Technical Committee. So the Technical Management Board, the TMB of ISO, had adopted a resolution and decided that in order to address this, that they would create a new PC, a new project committee, so that we could accommodate the broader scope of users. Once that was established, so now it's under ISO and it's not under one of the TCs, it is its own entity, this PC 302. This PC 302 has liaison, and when it was established, we reached out to as many different ISO committees, sector-specific organizations as we possibly could in order to address one of the concerns that I had previously mentioned, which was the fact that there are many different kinds of management system standards, and we need their input. We need for this to be a good document that works for everyone. So we're looking for input from the automotive folks and from medical device and from the telecommunications folks. All of these different entities. So there is broad participation. We need their comments. We need for them to tell us what they need to have in this document and what things in this document create obstacles to their ability to use it effectively. So that's where we are right now. We have this group called PC302. There's a few more slides on that later on. But let's talk about the standard itself. What do we have here, and what is going on with the standard? Most of it, there is a great deal of what is in the document that is going to be retained. There's a lot of good stuff in it. It has been a good document for a long time. But we're looking at some things here, the principles of auditing that you see in Section 4, not significant changes. Let me jump back here. Terms and definitions, there will be new terms and definitions as deemed appropriate. That's not a surprise. Not a lot of changes to definitions, but some new ones that may be added, again, reflecting changes in technology and quite frankly, changes in things that we've learned over the years. Principles of auditing, they themselves have not changed significantly. There's going to be some additional language around the managing of an audit program. And as we look down into some of the things that need to be considered in terms of managing the entire audit program, we look and we see in that first bullet, determining and evaluating audit program risks and opportunities. Remember, we said that this is not a management system standard. It is not going to follow the high-level structure. However, all of the management system standards, as they are revised, are all going to this model where looking at risks and opportunities is a requirement that pervades their entire quality management systems. It pervades the language of their standards. It would be inappropriate for this document not to nod to that, acknowledge that, and have some language in there. So there will be language talking about risks and opportunities, in this particular case, under how you put together your audit program. What are the risks associated with your audit program? Risks, for example, of not having adequate resources or not having people who have the right knowledge, or risks associated with the fact that you've got an organization that has multiple different sites and the inability to do this effectively. What opportunities does it present? And that's going to be different for all different organizations. Things around establishing the audit program objectives, not a whole bunch of changes in that. The audit objectives are all, that's basic fundamentals of auditing. There will be new things around auditing establishment of the program itself and the implementation, just because there have been changes in our world. There have been changes in technology, changes in processes and in how we communicate that affect that. So all of these things, this is the first category where we see that the program itself at its core foundation, when it's established, you're going to acknowledge that there's all of these things that will change, resources that are used, this acknowledgement that we need to look at risk, the manner in which things are implemented. All of these things have to be considered. Look at the rest of the standard, performing an audit. Again, there are things that change when you look at how you perform an audit, simply because when this audit was first written, the multi-site schemes and remote auditing, a lot of these things didn't exist. Performing audits in terms of dealing with a lot of electronic media. There's also a lot of security issues that didn't exist in the past that have to be considered. And it wasn't that they weren't basically implied in the previous version, but because of the world that we live in, they are more prominently discussed. And then we get into some of the more, again, we elaborate on some of the fundamentals, how you initiate an audit, how you prepare for it. There's a lot more rigor in terms of how you prepare for an audit than there would have been in days gone by. A lot more to consider in terms of the distribution of the audit report and some of the ways in which we follow up. So that is Section 6. There's going to be a lot of changes to that text that most of it reflects two things: changes in our world and the proliferation of multiple management system standards. How do you audit something when you've got multiple systems? Pardon me. Section 7, we're looking at the competence and evaluation of auditors. At this point, it's appropriate for me to mention very briefly, I'm going to be discussing this in one of the subsequent slides, but very quickly, one of the things that we looked at was the fact that whatever language we have in here cannot be inconsistent with the language around 17021 standards, the ISO 17021 standards that are developed by CASCO, the Conformity Assessment Committee that deals with auditor competence. I'll speak more about that later, but that was something that required extra rigor in the manner in which we put this language together. Obviously, our understanding of the concepts around competence have actually evolved, and you can see that in, for example, in ISO 9001 and indeed in the high-level structure. And it's reflected again in the fact that we had to change some of the language here. That's pretty much the body of the standard. There are multiple annexes, and some of them are going to be pretty much the same. Others will require substantial changes in terms of some of the examples that we use. Obviously, the examples have to be updated in order to address the world that we live in. But the annexes have a great deal of information in them, and again, because so many organizations don't have another reliable base tool to use, this is a great document for them to go to in order to better understand some of the nuts and bolts around auditing. So there's going to be some extra stuff in there. Virtual auditing is one of the categories where we're planning to put in some extra language. And, I need to reiterate, we are planning, we are in the revision. Some of this is all based upon what we expect. We're approximately halfway through the process. We are going to be meeting very soon on the DIS and looking through all of the comments on that. And based upon that, some of the things that I've mentioned here in terms of things that we plan to be in that document, that might change. There are some things that have been determined and others that we're still, we have not achieved consensus on. So some of these things, I say there might be stuff on virtual auditing. The degree to how much there will be is something that is not yet finalized. So please remember that as with any other document that it's in the middle of its revisions, that it ain't over till the fat lady sings. So who the heck is actually doing this revision now? You're accustomed to people talking about the ISO TC 176 as the biggie, which is the one that works on ISO 9001. Well, this is who we are. These are the folks who are responsible for that 19011 revision. The Secretariat is ANSI, American National Standards Institute, and so they are the Secretariat. I am the chair of this group, and our secretary is an extraordinarily capable woman of many resources, Jennifer Admeson, who definitely helps us get this going. Underneath that structure, so that, again, we can have this broad representation, is we have one joint working group. It's the only one in the PC. And we have two co-conveners. I am one of the co-conveners representing PC 302. However, we have another co-convener representing CASCO, also Dalrymple. And again, it's very, very important that we have CASCO involved in this so that we can get that input specifically on some of the concerns around 17021, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. The UK is represented with our secretary. We have 40 countries that are participating. Observing countries are countries who wish to come observe but are not necessarily, they will not submit comments and they will not vote on any of the ballots, but they wish to be informed on the process and on what, and on the evolution of the document. But we've got a lot of countries involved. And we have, within the U.S., we have our MIRROR committee, our technical advisory group, which had, at the time these slides were made, 74 members. So we've got a lot of input within the U.S. Developing the comments that the U.S. is indeed bringing to this international process. Other organizations, other countries, participating countries, have other ways in which they establish their MIRROR committees. Some of them have MIRROR committees that perhaps don't have as many participants in them, but go through a similar process so that they can submit their comments so that we get what we need in order to be able to put together a good document. So what are some of the other considerations that we had when we started out? Whenever this kind of project begins, we start with what is called a working draft. And what we used for our working draft was the previous version of 19,011. And so some of the things that we looked at immediately and made decisions upon were, for example, the terms and definitions. As I previously stated, it was determined that some terms and definitions would need to be added, that rather than citing one normative reference, we would include all the terms and definitions and add those as we deemed appropriate. We also made this decision. It's important to note because risk has become such an important word, such an important focus in all the documents, that's important to reiterate that the concept of risk-based thinking as applied to auditing and the manner in which race-based thinking is something that has to be considered and cannot be ignored as we're putting the language together. How that all plays out, I've given you some examples in the structure. How much more language we're going to have is yet to be determined. The other thing that we spent a lot of time discussing at our last meeting is this concept of remote auditing, that's also referred to as virtual auditing and e-auditing. And it was determined during that, as part of the discussions, that we kind of arrived at the conclusion that it's not a different type of auditing. It is simply auditing that requires consideration of different resources, constraints, and methods. So when we were talking earlier about the structure of this document, and we talked about things like, for example, planning your audit program, well, if you know that because of the structure of your organization or the nature of the auditing that you're going to be conducting, that you're going to have a lot of remote locations, and this is something you'd like to do, then you've got to put that into your program. You've got to ensure the adequate resources. You've got to make sure there's adequate security for links, that the integrity of those links is there. You've got to worry about things like time zones. What kind of constraints do you have? How do you ensure that you actually are getting valid information when you're dealing in a remote situation? All of those things need to be considered. This particular revision should probably result in more decisions around the extent to which that language will be probably in the annexes, giving people some tips on how to manage that. However, the decision made was not to have it identified as a unique or different kind of auditing, because it really isn't. It's just the same kind, the same notion, follows the same audit fundamentals, simply has different methods, resources, and constraints. Some of the other things that we considered, there were requests from some members that we put in more examples to better help the small and medium-sized enterprises. And what we ultimately decided is that if we tried to put in more examples, what we would end up with would be, for every example we gave, someone would come up and say, but you didn't put in this kind of example. You're not covering this kind of industry, this kind of profession, this particular kind of scenario. So rather than having a document that would ultimately be weaker if we attempt to do that, it was decided not to try and add more examples, to actually look at the examples we currently have and revise those, and just ensure that the language that we use and the examples that we use did not create an obstacle to small and medium-sized enterprises' ability to understand the requirements or the guidance in that document. We want the guidance to be written in such a way that any organization, regardless of size, regardless of scope, is capable of understanding and effectively utilizing the guidance that's found in the document. Again, we reiterate, did not use the high-level structure because this is not a management system standard. We therefore did not utilize that structure. However, we did acknowledge the fact that this is a really important document, the Annex SL, and we cannot ignore its existence, and we want to make sure that our language, again, does not create any barriers. We also had to consider, and this is still something that's ongoing, the extent to which the requirements now embedded in most documents around what we call 4.1, 4.2, which is the context of the organization, internal issues, external issues, relevant interested parties, the extent to which our document needs to reflect some of that. that whole new section, and that is something that has yet to be determined, but it is something that is under consideration. Finally, I mentioned earlier on that we have within the scope of our design specification the requirement that our standard must be complementary to 17021, which is ISO document that is owned by Casco. And you see that it says -X, and that's because they have added several. -3 is the one for quality management system standards. They are up to -11, so they are developing these for various schemes and various different scopes. And it is not possible for this PC 302 and the joint working group we don't have the bandwidth in order to be able to look at all of these documents and attempt in all instances to make sure that everything that we write is in concert with that. So what we have done instead, as I had mentioned earlier, is that we have reached out and established liaisons with all of the different entities who are affected by all these 17021 standards. And we're asking them to comment and to let us know, to inform us of the likelihood that some language might be inconsistent with their particular 17021 And that's the way that's being handled in order to ensure that we have broad representation, that the language does not create a barrier for anyone, and that nothing in it is in conflict with the Casco 17021 documents. So when is all of this going to happen? Well, the ballot is closed for the CD. We are meeting in Milan a week after next, and we expect that sometime out of that, sometime in the middle of May, that we will have a DIS, a draft international standard that is going to go out for comment and for ballot. Expecting the ballot for that to close sometime in October. The U.S. will have their mirror committee meeting in Dallas in October. Plenary meeting shortly thereafter. Those two are not necessarily synced to each other. It's just convenient for the U.S., but completely irrelevant for the PC 302 meeting. We're ultimately hoping to have a publication in April of next year. The one thing about PC's project committees is that they do have a limited life, and we were told that we had 24 months in which to accomplish this. So we are in a very, very tight deadline. And we are trying very hard to stay within the scope of that timeline that's been handed down to us. So that's what's going on with that particular document. If you want to know a little bit more about who are the people who are doing this, like I've talked to you about PCs, and I've talked to you about the joint working group, and I've talked to you about representation in the various groups, and the next question is, well, who are these folks? So I'd like to give you a couple of slides here about, how are these standards developed? So the standards are developed by technical committees or project committees, as in the case of 302, that are established within ISO. And there are countries who are known as member bodies who participate. In some instances, we also have liaisons. So within the United States, within the U.S., we are represented, or we represent ANSI. So when we go to the international meetings, we are there as representatives of ANSI. So that is the official body of the U.S. Within those, we have technical advisory groups, and probably one of the largest in the U.S. is TC 176, which is the one that brings you ISO 9001 and all of the other documents in the TC 176 portfolio. So that would be TAG 176. Another example of that is TAG 207, which is the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, looking at standards that relate to TC 207, the environmental standards, for example, 14001. Within these groups, who are the members? Who are the members of the technical advisory groups? Well, they're called technical experts. And the technical experts deliberate on these documents, formulate comments, deliberate over the comments, and decide upon that how our our country, or we as a participating member, how we will vote internationally and what kind of position we will put forth, what kind of comments for the next phase of any particular document. So within the U.S., these are some of the technical advisories, the tags that are administered by ASQ. 176 on management, 207 on environmental. We've got one for statistical methods. We have the tag 302, which is the mirror body for PC 302, which is the subject of this particular presentation on 19,011. So I wanted you to have a little bit of information on who the heck are the folks that actually bring you these standards. And if you want any further information, I encourage you to go to the link that you find on this, this slide. So that brings us to the end of our presentation on 19,011. If you want any further information, please go to the standards folks and they will find me. My email is here. You can certainly email me and ask me any questions around what's happening with 19,011. I thank you very much for your kind attention. That concludes
This ends today's presentation. Thanks for attending.